At 19, Nora Voss had $8, a duffel bag with a broken zipper, and a set of keys that didn't open any door she was welcome at. She'd been out of her mother's house for 11 days and out of her grandmother's house for 4, and the cousin she'd called in desperation said sorry, no room, and hung up before she could finish the sentence. The county auction that Saturday had one lot nobody raised a hand for, a rotting grain silo on 40 acres of dead grass outside Harlan, Kansas, assessed at $8, because the inspector had written structural total loss across the bottom of his report. Nora raised her hand. But 3 weeks later, when she climbed the rusted ladder and lowered herself into the belly of that chute, she found something sealed inside an iron pipe that her great-uncle Clement Voss had bolted shut before she was born, something the whole county remembered, even if his own family had spent 30 years pretending it didn't exist. The eviction notice had been taped to the door with a single strip of packing tape, the cheap kind that barely holds. Nora found it on a Tuesday. She'd been living in her mother's house, which was really her mother's boyfriend Gary's house, since she was 15, moving into the spare room after her grandmother couldn't afford the gas to heat the second floor of her place in Wichita. The spare room at Gary's was off the kitchen, small and cold in winter and an oven in summer, with a window that looked directly onto the neighbor's HVAC unit. Nora had made it work. She'd painted the wall above her bed a pale yellow with leftover paint from the garage. She'd put up a shelf for her books. She had a small lamp that cast a warm light and a quilt her grandmother had sewn from old flannel shirts, blue and gray and faded red. The notice said she and her mother had 14 days. Her mother was at Gary's sister's place in Hutchinson when Nora called. The phone rang 6 times before she picked up. The call was short. Gary had stopped paying the mortgage months ago. There was nothing to do. Her mother would stay in Hutchinson for a while. There was no room there for Nora. She was 19 years old and the world was informing her, clearly and without apology, that she did not fit anywhere inside it. She spent the first 4 days at her grandmother's apartment in Wichita. She slept on the couch with her feet hanging over the armrest and ate toast and soup, and told her grandmother she was fine. Her grandmother was 81 and walked with a cane, and kept the heat at 63 degrees because the bill was too high. She had macular degeneration in her left eye and was waiting on a surgery she couldn't afford. Nora helped her sort the mail and read the television guide out loud and said nothing about how long she intended to stay. On the 5th day her grandmother sat down beside her on the couch and took her hand. "Nora, honey," she said. "I can't." She didn't say can't what. She didn't need to. Nora packed the duffel bag and called her cousin Brent from the parking lot. Brent was 26 and lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Topeka with a roommate and a dog, and what seemed, from the outside, like a normal life. Brent said sorry, no room. He said it before she finished explaining. The line went dead. She sat on a bench outside a laundromat for 2 hours watching people carry their clothes inside in hampers and out in neat folded stacks. A woman dropped a sock and didn't notice. Nora picked it up off the sidewalk and set it on top of a trash can where the woman would see it on her way back to her car. The woman never came back. Nora had $63 in a checking account that her first job at a grocery store had built up to $212 before her hours got cut. She had a phone with 40% battery and a cracked screen. She had the duffel bag, the quilt from her grandmother, and a paperback novel she'd already read twice. She walked to the library and sat at a computer for 3 hours looking for anything she could afford. Rooms for rent were $300 minimum. Shelters were full. The county resource hotline rang 9 times and went to voicemail. On Thursday, she found the auction listing. It was a county tax lien auction, the kind that listed properties in a table without photographs, just addresses and assessed values and the minimum bid. Most of the listings were empty lots and abandoned buildings, assessed at values between $800 and $8,000. She scrolled through them without any purpose beyond killing time. The 5th page had a single lot highlighted in red because the assessed value was so low the county had flagged it as a potential data entry error. 40 acres, Harlan Township, Ellis County. 1 structure, grain storage silo, corrugated steel construction, built 1947, assessed condition, derelict. Structural total loss notation. Current assessed value, $8, minimum bid, $8. Nora read the listing 4 times. She had $8.53. She called the county assessor's office and asked if the listing was real. The woman on the phone said yes. She asked if anyone had bid on it. Not yet. She asked if you could bid in person on the day. Yes. She asked if you could bid $8. There's a minimum bid, yes, $8. The auction was Saturday morning in Harlan, which was a town Nora had never been to, 90 miles southwest of Wichita. She borrowed bus fare from her grandmother without telling her what for. The auction was held outside the Ellis County Courthouse, a squat brick building on a tree-lined square. About a dozen people were there for the other listings, farmers mostly, and two men in polo shirts who were probably developers. When the auctioneer reached the grain silo lot, he read the description with the flat efficiency of someone who had already decided nothing interesting was going to happen. He announced the minimum bid. Nobody raised a hand, nobody except Nora. She held up her hand. The auctioneer looked at her. One or two people turned to see who had bid. Nobody raised theirs to counter, going once, going twice. She paid $8 from her wallet, exact change, and walked out of the courthouse holding a printout of a deed. The bus didn't go to Harlan. She hitchhiked the last 12 miles with a man hauling hay bales in a flatbed truck who didn't ask any questions and dropped her at a crossroads with a hand-painted sign that said Harlan, 2 miles. She walked. The silo was visible before the town was. It rose above the flat horizon like a metal tower, round and rusted and still. The corrugated walls darkened with age to a color somewhere between brown and the color of dried blood. It stood at the edge of a property that had once been a working farm. The farmhouse was gone, long gone, nothing left but a foundation and a cellar door that the grass had mostly swallowed. A windmill that hadn't turned in years stood at an angle 40 feet away, its tail fin twisted toward the ground. The 40 acres around the silo were dead. The grass was dormant and pale. Winter had come early to the high plains, and the sky above the property was the low, flat gray of a sheet of cold metal. The wind moved across the open ground without obstacle, steady and cold, pressing Nora's jacket flat against her chest. She stood at the property line and looked at what $8 had bought her. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't promising. It was a derelict cylinder of corrugated steel on a patch of dead ground under a gray sky at the edge of a town that barely showed up on the map. But it was hers. She walked to it. The silo was about 30 feet tall and maybe 20 feet in diameter, the kind built for on-farm grain storage in the 1940s. A rusted ladder ran up the outside to a platform and hatch at the top. A chute assembly extended from the lower third of the wall, the system that had once funneled grain out to a wagon or truck. The chute was sealed with a bolted steel plate that looked newer than everything else, less rusted, more deliberate. The main access door at the base was padlocked with a lock that had rusted around its shackle. The keys from the county had two on the ring. The smaller one opened the padlock after she worked at it for several minutes, scraping rust loose from the mechanism. Inside, the silo smelled like dust and old grain and the cold particular smell of metal in winter. The floor was concrete, cracked in one corner where a weed had managed to push through. The walls curved around her, and the space was surprisingly large on the inside, open and circular, the light filtering from above through a ventilation gap around the hatch. In the center of the floor, someone had left a folding chair. It was old, the kind with a webbed seat in orange and white, one of the metal feet capped with a rubber tip that had cracked and peeled away. The chair sat exactly in the center of the concrete floor as if placed there deliberately, as if someone had sat in it and left and expected to come back. On the seat of the chair was a folding pocket knife with a worn wooden handle, a tin of black shoe polish with the lid rusted on, and a photograph in a plastic sleeve, slightly curled at one corner. Nora picked up the photograph. An old man in overalls stood beside the silo. Younger silo, straighter walls, the corrugated steel shining new. The man was squinting against the sun, one hand resting on the metal wall, the other holding a coffee tin. He was smiling. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil, Clement Voss, 1949. Harlan, Kansas, first full harvest. Nora turned the photograph over and looked at the man's face again. She knew his name. Her grandmother had said it once, years ago, in the way you say the name of someone you're not supposed to talk about. Her great-uncle Clem, her grandmother's brother. He'd had a falling out with the family decades ago over something to do with money, and nobody had talked about him since. He'd died years before Nora was born. She didn't know any more than that. She looked at the folding chair in the center of the floor. She set down the duffel bag and sat in it. The webbing held her weight. The cold metal silo rose around her in a perfect circle, and the gray light came down from above, and she was 19 years old and homeless, and sitting in a dead man's chair on a piece of dead ground in a small town where she knew nobody. She didn't leave. It was late afternoon, maybe 2 hours of light left. She went back outside and walked the perimeter of the property, learning what she had. At the far corner, under a collapsed lean-to, she found a stack of old wooden pallets, warped but dry. She found a coil of rope that had gone stiff, and a tarp weighted down by a cinder block. She found a dented metal bucket and a cast iron grate that might once have been part of a small stove. She brought the tarp inside and hung it over one section of the curved wall to block the wind that found the gap around the chute assembly. She arranged the pallets as a raised platform and spread her grandmother's quilt over them. She filled the bucket from the hand pump she found at the base of the windmill that, when she worked the handle long enough, produced actual water, brown at first and then clear. She made a bed and she made a camp, and she was still cold, but she was out of the wind. In the morning she would figure out the rest. For now she had a floor and a roof, and the photograph of a man named Clement Voss who had stood in the same place 70 years ago and smiled. She held the photograph until the light faded to nothing. 3 weeks later, she climbed the ladder. She'd been living in the silo since the auction. It was not comfortable. It was barely survivable in the first 2 weeks, before she found the second-hand sleeping bag at a thrift store in Harlan and the propane camp stove at a yard sale for $4 she didn't really have. But she'd started working at the grain elevator in town 4 days after she arrived. The manager, a man named Dwight, had given her 6 hours of day labor unloading trucks and said come back tomorrow when she didn't complain. And by the third week, she was getting 20 hours a week and eating actual meals. She'd patched the gap around the chute assembly with strips of foam insulation and duct tape. She'd rigged a shelf from a plank and 2 nails. She'd gotten the padlock's shackle freed up so it opened smoothly. The silo was still cold and strange and nothing like a home, but it was hers, and nobody was going to tape an eviction notice to the door. She'd looked at the chute assembly every day. It was a standard grain chute, the kind that let stored grain flow from the silo to a vehicle below. This one had been modified. At some point, someone had removed the original chute plate and replaced it with a welded steel assembly that was heavier and more deliberate than the original engineering. The bolts were not factory. The welding was hand-done, careful. It had been installed specifically to seal something off. The county keys hadn't included one that fit the bolts. She'd bought a socket set on credit at the hardware store. On a Saturday morning 3 weeks in, she climbed the ladder with the socket set. Bolts were tight with age and cold, and she stripped the first one before she found the right torque. The second came loose more easily. The third and fourth she worked out carefully, setting each one in her jacket pocket. The plate came away with a scrape of metal on metal, and a smell of dust and old paper and something dry and cool drifted out. Inside the chute cavity, sealed from the grain flow by the welded plate, was an iron pipe, capped at both ends, about 18 inches long and 4 inches in diameter. It was held in place by 2 metal straps bolted to the interior wall. Nora worked the end cap with her socket set. The threads resisted, then caught, then turned. She pulled the cap free. Inside the pipe was a rolled leather document tube, soft and dark with age. Inside the tube was a bundle of papers wrapped in oilskin and tied with waxed cord. She climbed back down to the floor, set the pipe on her makeshift shelf, and unwrapped the oilskin with hands that were not entirely steady. The papers were in good condition. Dry, protected, slightly yellowed at the edges but legible, 3 separate documents. The first was handwritten on pages that matched the leather tube in age. She recognized the handwriting from the back of the photograph, the same steady cursive. She read the title on the first page, Record of Account. Clement Voss, Harlan Township, Ellis County, Kansas. Begun January 1, 1952. She sat on the pallet bed and read. The record was organized like a ledger, columns for date, name, amount, purpose, and a final column headed simply, Forgiven. Most of the entries in that last column had a single check mark. Some had a date beside the check. A few had short notes. February 1952. Henderson Ray, $40 seed money spring planting. Wife expecting, lost his tractor in January. Checkmark. Note, paid back $20 in August. Told him keep the rest. He fed 4 kids on what that planting produced. March 1952. Colby Darling, $15 for her mother's medicine. Husband laid off at the rail yard. No expectation of repayment. Note, her mother lived 2 more years. Good years, she said. April 1952. Sutter Harold, $60 for his boys' school fees. Harold is too proud to ask twice. Left it in the wheel well of his truck. Doesn't know where it came from. The entries continued across 4 pages, then 5, then more. Clement Voss had been keeping this record for years, decades. The handwriting was consistent across the full span, the same careful cursive, only slightly shakier in the later pages. The amounts ranged from $10 to several hundred. The purposes were always the same: seed money, medical bills, school fees, heat in January, rent in March, groceries in a bad week. The forgiven column was almost entirely check marks. Nora turned to the second document. It was shorter, 3 pages more formal. The language was legal, or as close to legal as a man without a lawyer might manage. It was titled, Statement of Intent Regarding the Property. Clem had written it in 1978, 11 years before Nora was born. He began with a single sentence. I am writing this because I intend to leave the land to someone who will not waste it, and I want that person to understand why the land exists. He described the farm: 40 acres, not good farmland by any standard, too much clay in the south quarter, too rocky in the north. He'd bought it in 1947 with money saved over 10 years of working other men's harvests. He'd built the silo himself with help from 3 neighbors whose names he listed. He'd run grain storage for local farms through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The operation was small. It had never made him rich. But it had made him useful, and Clem appeared to believe, as Nora read this, that usefulness was the measure of a life. In the late 1960s, when the big elevator companies moved in and made his small operation uneconomical, he'd stopped taking in grain and started doing something else with the silo. He didn't describe what. He said only, the silo is still in use. Not for grain. He described the town. Families he'd watched struggle through dry years and bad markets, and the slow bleed of small farming in the age of corporate agriculture. He described what he'd tried to do about it: the loans he'd made, the debts he'd forgiven, the things he'd left in truck beds and glove boxes and under doors because too much pride was already one of the county's chief exports. Then he wrote, I have no children of my own. My family has not spoken to me in many years over a matter of money and pride, mostly my own. But somewhere in that family, there may be someone who understands what this place was for. If that person finds this, then I was right to wait. The silo is for them. The third document was a deed supplement, notarized by a county clerk, transferring the mineral rights and subsurface easements on the 40 acres into a designated remainder trust. The trust had a trustee, a Harlan attorney named Aldous Gray, who had died in 1991. Below the attorney's name was a handwritten note from Clem in the margin. If Aldous is gone before you read this, the county clerk has a copy of the trust instrument. It is registered. Ask for it by name, the Voss Remainder Trust. Nora held the papers carefully. The trust was registered, which meant it still existed. Which meant Clem had anticipated the possibility that it might not be discovered for a very long time, and had built a structure intended to survive his absence and the absence of everyone he knew. She looked at the photograph again. The man squinting into the sun, hand on the silo wall, smiling for a camera that had belonged to someone she didn't know. Great Uncle Clem, the one nobody talked about. She'd had a home for 3 weeks, and she had just discovered it was built on 40 years of someone else's quiet generosity. She sat on the pallet bed in the center of the silo as the morning light dropped down through the hatch overhead and turned gold on the concrete floor. She had no words yet for what she was feeling. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was more like recognition. The sensation of finding something that had been put here, deliberately, by someone who had believed, without proof, without promise, that she would come. The post office in Harlan was a single room on the south end of Main Street, sandwiched between a closed insurance office and a hardware store that Nora had been in twice. It was staffed by a woman named Delia Hurst, 62 years old, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with gray hair she kept in a bun and reading glasses she wore perched on her forehead like a second set of eyes. Delia had been postmistress in Harlan for 21 years. She knew every name on every mailbox in the county, and most of the stories attached to them. Nora had come in twice before to buy stamps she didn't need, because the post office was warm and Delia didn't ask questions. On the third visit, Delia slid a cup of coffee across the counter without being asked. You're the girl who bought Clem's silo, Delia said. News travels fast. News travels at the speed of Dwight telling his wife. Dwight's wife talks to everyone. Delia poured herself a cup. You living out there, for now, in the silo. There's a floor, it's dry. Delia studied her over the rim of her cup with the focused expression of someone taking an inventory. How old are you? 19. Delia set her cup down and folded her hands on the counter. What happened? Nora told her the short version. Eviction, grandmother's couch, the auction. Delia listened without interrupting, which was more than most people had managed. When Nora finished, Delia picked her cup back up and looked at the wall. Clem Voss, she said. I was maybe 30 when he died. He'd been around my whole life, everybody's whole life. She turned back to Nora. You know what he used to do? I found his ledger. Delia went very still, then she leaned forward across the counter. You found it, inside the chute. Sealed in a pipe. Delia shook her head slowly. He always said he'd written it down. We thought maybe he was saying it because he was getting old and maybe not entirely. She stopped. The ledger, you found the actual ledger. All of it, every name, every amount, going back to 1952. Delia sat down on the stool behind her. She was quiet for a long moment. My father is in that ledger, she said. I'd bet my pension on it. We had a bad year in 61. My mother got sick and my father had already borrowed from the bank as far as they'd let him. Then somehow the doctor's bill got paid and my father never told anyone how. We asked. He said somebody helped. He didn't know who. She looked at Nora directly. If Clem's ledger has my father's name in it, I've been waiting 60 years to say thank you to the right person. Nora found the entry that afternoon. March 1961. Hurst Martin, $65, wife's hospital bill, 4 months overdue. Note, left it at the county clerk's desk in an envelope. He'll think it's from an anonymous fund the county runs. No such fund, but he'll accept it. She brought the ledger to the post office the next morning. Delia read the entry without speaking. She read it twice. Then she removed her reading glasses and pressed them against her face and was very still for a while. That man, she said finally. That stubborn, quiet, generous man. She put the ledger down carefully on the counter, the way you set down something that has weight beyond its actual weight. He never told anyone what he was doing, Delia said. Not a soul. You'd hear whispers sometimes, somebody's bill got paid, somebody got a bag of seed they didn't ask for, somebody found money in a wheel well. But nobody could ever pin it to Clem because Clem would look at you with that face of his, that absolutely blank face, and say he didn't know anything about it. Did people suspect? The people who knew him well suspected, but Clem had a way of carrying his own business that made you feel like asking about it would be rude. Delia smiled at the counter. He came in here every week for his mail. Never had much. A few bills, the farm extension newsletter. He always brought me a tomato from his garden when they were coming in. Left it on the counter without comment. Just put it down and walked out. Nora thought of the folding chair in the center of the silo floor. Someone had sat in that chair, season after season, with a ledger and a tin of shoe polish and a pocket knife, and kept a record of kindnesses the whole county was receiving without knowing where they came from. The trust document mentions mineral rights, Nora said. A Voss Remainder Trust. Do you know anything about it? Delia thought for a moment. There was always talk about Clem having something set aside, nothing specific, you know how people talk. She picked up her phone. But I know who to call. Sheila at the county clerk's office has been there 40 years. If that trust is registered, she'll have heard of it. The call took 3 minutes. When Delia hung up, she looked at Nora with an expression that had something careful in it. The Voss Remainder Trust is registered, she said. Registered in 1979. The original trustee died in 91, but the trust transferred to the county clerk's custodial record per the trust instrument. She paused. It has a designated remainder beneficiary. The trust was writ to transfer to the last lineal descendant of Clement, Voss's sister Margaret Voss Carlin, who presents a claim within 60 years of Clem's death. Nora held very still. Clem died in 1989, Delia said. 60 years from 1989 was 2049. I'm Margaret's granddaughter, Nora said. Delia looked at her. I know, she said. I've been delivering mail to the Carlin and Voss families my whole career. I know who you are. She folded her hands on the counter. I'd say Clem knew too, or he was trying very hard to make sure that whoever found that silo could find their way back to it. Nora sat down on the wooden bench along the wall, the folding chair in the center of the floor. The sealed pipe in the chute. The trust registered and waiting. The property assessed at $8 at a county auction with no minimum reserve, as if it had been priced to be affordable to someone with nothing. A man she'd never met had arranged all of it. He'd done it without knowing her name or her face or anything about her beyond the fact that she existed somewhere in the family that had stopped speaking to him. He'd built a structure and set it to wait. Nora thought about the first night. The folding chair in the darkness. How she'd sat in it because she had nowhere else to sit, because the world had made it clear there was no space for her anywhere, and a dead man's chair in a dead man's silo was what was left. Maybe that had been the point. Delia brought her a second cup of coffee. The trust has funds in it, Delia said carefully. I don't know how much. Sheila said it's been collecting interest since 1979. You'd need to contact an attorney to make a formal claim. Nora held the mug with both hands. Outside, the wind was moving across the flat Kansas plain, steady and cold and indifferent the way it always was, but inside the post office it was warm. I'll need to find an attorney, Nora said. I know one, Delia said. She owes me a favor. Come back Thursday. Nora walked back to the silo along the gravel road. The windmill was visible from half a mile out, tilted and still. The silo rose straight and solid behind it. Dwight had offered her more hours starting the following week. She'd been saying yes to everything he offered, not because she loved the work. The grain elevator was loud and cold and smelled like chaff, but because every hour was $1 more between herself and nothing. She'd started learning the systems, how the elevator worked, what the grades of wheat meant, how to read the moisture meter. Dwight had noticed. He'd given her a more detailed task each week. She thought about Clem's ledger. All those families, all those years. The man had run a grain storage operation and used the income, the modest, insufficient income of a small independent elevator, to hold his community together one quiet act at a time. She hadn't known yet what she was going to do with the property. She had 40 acres and a silo and the beginning of a registered trust claim. She didn't have a plan. But for the first time since the eviction notice, she felt something take shape that was tentative and small but real. She wasn't just surviving inside Clem's silo. She was beginning to understand what it was for. Delia's attorney arrived on Thursday as promised, a woman in her 50s named Bev Acaffer who practiced out of a home office in Ellis, 20 miles east. She drove a practical sedan, wore a practical blazer, and shook Nora's hand at the post office with the efficiency of someone who had already done her homework. I've reviewed the trust instrument, Bev said. Delia sent me a copy of the county clerk's record. The trust is legitimate and has been properly maintained in custodial status. They sat at the small table in the back of the post office, where Delia stored the overflow holiday mail. The trust holds 3 assets, Bev continued. The mineral and subsurface rights to the 40-acre property, those transferred to the trust in 1979, an insurance policy that converted to a paid-up whole life policy and accrued cash value, and a savings instrument, originally a passbook account, that was transferred to a certificate of deposit upon Clem's death and has been rolling over annually since 1989. How much? Nora asked. Bev told her the numbers. The CD and the insurance cash value together, after 30-plus years of rolling interest, came to $81,000 and change. The mineral rights had a separate assessed value that would require an independent survey, but were likely worth several times that given recent subsurface interest in Ellis County. Nora looked at Delia. Delia looked at the table. He built that for whoever found it, Nora said. He built it to survive, Bev said. The trust instrument is explicit. He expected it might not be claimed for a generation. He wanted the funds to still be meaningful when they arrived. She set her pen on the table. To make a formal claim, you'll need to establish lineage and file a claimant petition with the county court. Given that you've presented the original trust documents and the property deed, this is a relatively straightforward process. She paused. Relatively. How long? 4 to 6 weeks for an uncontested claim. If anyone challenges it, who would challenge it? Bev looked at her carefully. Family challenges are the most common. Anyone who believes they have a competing claim to the estate of Clement Voss, or who argues that the trust itself was improperly constituted. You said you have a cousin. Nora thought of Brent, who had said sorry, no room, before she'd finished her sentence. She thought of the family who had stopped speaking to Clem over a matter of money and pride. Yes, she said. I have a cousin. Then file promptly, Bev said, before anyone else learns the trust exists. They filed on Monday. By Wednesday, the whole town knew. Nora was behind the counter at the grain elevator when Dwight came out of his office with a look on his face she hadn't seen from him before. He closed the door behind him. Got a call from Ellis County this morning, he said. Some family member of yours asked the county clerk about a trust instrument. Brent, Nora said. I don't know the name. But whoever it was filed a competing claim by noon. Nora set down the moisture meter. He filed it same day. By noon. Dwight looked at her steadily. Do you have representation? Bev Acaffer in Ellis. Call her now, use my phone. Brent's claim arrived formally by Friday. Boyd Voss, not Brent. Nora had forgotten about Boyd. He was older, a second cousin on the Voss side, late 40s, who had left Kansas for Denver 15 years ago and ran some kind of property management operation. She'd met him once at a family gathering when she was 12, and he'd ignored her entirely. He had apparently found out about the trust through a family network she hadn't known was still active, and he'd acted within hours. His attorney's letter was formal and dense. Boyd was claiming that, as the male line descendant of Clement Voss's brother Harold Voss, he had an equal or superior claim to the trust under the terms of the instrument. His attorney argued that the restriction to lineal descendants of Margaret Voss Carlin was ambiguous, and that the broader Voss family estate should be considered. He was requesting a court order to freeze the trust assets pending resolution. Bev read the letter and set it down. He doesn't have a strong claim, she said. The trust instrument is clear. Clem wrote it to benefit the Carlin line specifically. He named your grandmother's branch explicitly. Why would he do that? Bev was quiet for a moment. I think he had reasons that are probably in that ledger of his. Nora thought of the ledger entries, the names, the amounts. She hadn't read all of them yet. There were over 400 pages. There might be a Boyd Voss in there, she said. Might be more than that, Bev said. Find every Voss entry you can. She spent 3 evenings at the post office's back table going through the ledger with Delia. Most of the names were local families she didn't know. But on page 217, in an entry dated November 1974, she found it. Voss, Harold, $2,000. Business loan for his son Boyd's first property venture. Boyd is 22, wants to buy a duplex in Topeka. Harold doesn't have it himself. Loan from the silo account. Harold says Boyd will pay it back. The forgiven column, blank, no checkmark, no note about repayment. Below it, 6 months later, Voss, Harold follow up. Boyd says he'll pay when the duplex turns a profit. Harold is embarrassed, told him not to mention it again. Below that, 2 years later, Voss, Harold, reminder to self. The $2,000 loan to Boyd has not been repaid. Boyd has sold the duplex at a profit, has not contacted me. Harold has not contacted me. I think they believe I've forgotten. I have not forgotten. I'm not waiting for the money. I'm writing it down because I want someone to know that a man can receive a kindness and choose to bury it, and that the burying is a kind of theft, not of dollars but of the record of what goodness was attempted. Nora set the ledger on the table. Delia had been reading over her shoulder. She was quiet for a moment. Boyd Voss built his whole operation on Clem's $2,000, Delia said. The duplex was the first. He had 4 properties by the time he was 30. And Clem knew. And Clem wrote it down. Delia looked at the page. He didn't write it to punish Boyd. He wrote it because he needed someone to know. Because somewhere in him he believed that the ledger would eventually be found and that the record would matter. Nora closed the ledger. Outside, the wind was moving across the plain. The silo was visible from the post office window, just barely, at the edge of the town's sight line, round and rusted and still. Boyd Voss had received Clem's generosity, buried it, and was now appearing 35 years later to claim what Clem had tried to leave somewhere else. Nora thought about what that meant. She thought about the folding chair in the center of the floor. She thought about Clem writing it down because I want someone to know. She picked up the ledger. I need to show Bev this entry, she said. I know, Delia said. She was already reaching for her phone. That weekend, something happened that Nora hadn't expected. She came back to the silo on Saturday afternoon to find Dwight's truck parked on the property line. He was standing beside it with 2 men she didn't recognize and what appeared to be a toolbox. What are you doing? She asked. Fixing your roof, Dwight said. He nodded toward the silo's upper section where a seam had opened in the corrugated steel and let in water. Nora had been monitoring the rust expansion along that seam for 2 weeks. Dale here does metal work. Said he can seal it in half a day. Dwight, I can't pay for that right now. Dwight looked at her. Did I ask? You can't just. My father borrowed a disc harrow from Clem Voss in 1963, Dwight said. Kept it for a season. Clem never asked for it back. When my father finally returned it, Clem had already bought a new one and just gave my father the old disc harrow. My father used it for 30 years. He picked up the toolbox and handed it to Dale. This is the disc harrow. Nora stood aside. By late afternoon, the seam was sealed, and the 2 men were back in Dwight's truck, and Dwight was accepting a cup of coffee from the thermos Nora had brought out without a word about it being the best way he knew of to say thank you for something that cost money. The silo was still standing. The seam was sealed. And Nora understood that she had inherited not just 40 acres and a trust document, but an entire network of people who had been waiting for someone to come back and open the door. What she didn't yet know was how much Boyd Voss was willing to spend to close it again. Take a breath. What happens next is the part that changes everything, and it goes much further than you think. If you're still with Nora's story, subscribe and let's finish it together. The letter from Boyd's attorney arrived on a Monday. It was denser than the first, 8 pages, and this time it had exhibits. Boyd's lawyers had located a county assessor's record showing a natural gas exploration lease issued on a portion of the Ellis County farmland, adjacent to the Voss property. The lease was speculative, the kind the energy companies filed broadly across western Kansas during the last decade, covering areas where shale deposits had been identified but not confirmed. Boyd's attorney was arguing that the mineral rights in the Voss Remainder Trust might intersect with the lease area, making the trust assets potentially much more valuable than the face value of the CD and insurance policy. The argument was circular and thin, Bev told Nora, but it gave Boyd's lawyers a basis to request discovery and slow the process down. He's not trying to win in court, Bev said. He's trying to make this expensive enough that you give up. I don't have anything to give up, Nora said. That's your advantage, he doesn't know that. Bev looked at the exhibit list. These mineral rights surveys are going to cost time, but they're going to cost him money too. Nora thought about Boyd's Denver property management operation. The duplexes and then the buildings and then whatever had come after. All of it beginning with $2,000 from Clem's silo account in 1974. She thought about the entry in the ledger. A man can receive a kindness and choose to bury it. He knows about the ledger, Nora said. Bev looked up. What makes you think so? Because he moved the same day we filed. He knew I'd found the silo. He knew I'd found the documents. He filed before I could organize anything because he needed to get there first. She looked at the attorney's letter. And because he knows what's in the ledger. Bev set her pen down. If he knows he's in that ledger, if he knows that Clem recorded the unpaid loan, then he understands that the ledger is evidence that Clem intended the trust for your line specifically and not his. He's not just trying to claim the trust, Nora said. He's trying to make sure nobody looks at what Clem wrote down. Bev looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. Can I see the ledger? She asked. Nora gave it to her. She sat across the table in the back of the post office, and Bev took 3 hours going through every page while Nora helped Delia sort the afternoon mail. When Bev finished, she stacked the pages carefully and tied the oilskin wrapper back around them. This is a complete private record of 40 years of financial transactions, Bev said. The legal weight of it as evidence of testamentary intent is significant. Clem was clearly of sound mind, consistent in his record keeping, and explicit about his intentions in the statement of intent document. She paused. The Boyd entry is not incriminating in a criminal sense, but in the context of this case, it demonstrates that Clem was aware of the Voss mail line and deliberately chose not to include them in the trust. That's extremely useful. Boyd would know that, Nora said. Yes, which means he needs to prevent this ledger from being entered into evidence. Or he needs to argue that it's inadmissible or fabricated or insufficient. Bev tapped the oilskin with one finger. File the original with the court clerk. I want it in the evidentiary record before he can move to challenge its authenticity. They filed it Tuesday. Boyd's attorneys moved to exclude it on Thursday. The motion was dense and technical, arguing that a private diary-style document had insufficient evidentiary foundation without independent corroboration. The argument was creative. It was also the kind of motion that told you a great deal about how worried the person who requested it actually was. Nora was working the early shift at the elevator when Delia called her. You need to come to the post office, Delia said. When you're done. She came in at noon. The post office back table was occupied by Delia and 3 other people Nora didn't fully recognize. A man with white hair and a western shirt, sitting very straight. A woman in her 60s with her hands folded on the table. A younger man, maybe 40, in work clothes with a grain dust stain on his left sleeve that matched the stain on Nora's right. This is Eugene Henderson, Delia said, nodding to the white-haired man. His father was Ray Henderson. Nora looked at the man. Ray Henderson. February 1952. $40 seed money spring planting. The first entry, Nora said. Eugene nodded. He unfolded a piece of paper from his shirt pocket. My father kept a letter Clem sent him in 1952, never asked for the money back, said it was a gift. I've had it my whole life. He set the letter on the table. I'll testify to that, and I'll bring the letter. The woman was Sandra Colby, whose grandmother was Darlene Colby from the March 1952 entry. She had a photograph of Clem taken at a county fair in 1955, with her grandmother visible in the background. She had a letter from her grandmother's papers referencing an anonymous benefactor who had helped during a hard year. The younger man was Dale Sutter, the metal worker who had sealed the silo seam. His grandfather was Harold Sutter. He had his grandfather's diary from 1952 with an entry that said, "The school fees came from somewhere. I don't know where. God willing, I'll find out someday and pay it back." Nora looked at the 3 of them. You all came here to help me, she said. We came here because Clem Voss helped our families and nobody ever got to thank him properly, Delia said. If a court wants corroboration for that ledger, they'll have it. She thought about Bev's argument. She thought about Boyd's motion to exclude. How many other families are in that ledger, she asked. Delia and I counted, Eugene Henderson said. 43 names. Over 400 entries, spanning 40 years. He looked at the post office wall. Half those families are still in this county. The other half have children and grandchildren who are. Outside, the wind moved across the plain. Nora looked at the three people at the table. People who had received something from Clem Voss long before she was born, and who had been carrying it ever since, waiting without knowing they were waiting for the moment when it would matter. I'm going to need everyone who is willing to come to the hearing, she said. Eugene Henderson folded his hands on the table. We know, he said. She filed her first formal response to Boyd's legal motion the following week. The filing included 3 sworn affidavits corroborating specific entries in the ledger, a letter from 1952 matching the ledger's handwriting and date, 2 period photographs showing Clem Voss on the property, and a chain of custody statement for the oilskin bundle, establishing that the documents had been sealed inside the chute cavity and undisturbed since the property transfer. Boyd's attorneys responded by requesting a handwriting analysis. The handwriting analysis came back 3 weeks later, consistent with the same author across a span of approximately 40 years, with age-appropriate variation in the later entries, consistent with an aging hand. Then Nora found the second document. She had been back inside the chute assembly doing a final inspection after Dale's roof repair work when she noticed that the iron pipe had a second cap on the far end that she hadn't fully examined. She'd assumed it was a sealed end cap. When she looked more carefully with a flashlight, she saw the seam. A second pipe cap, threaded, smaller, recessed inside the first. It took 20 minutes to work it loose. Inside was a single sealed envelope, the kind with a red wax seal pressed with what appeared to be a thumbprint rather than a seal stamp. On the front, in Clem's handwriting, for the one who finds this. Open it when you need to remember why. She brought it inside, sat in the folding chair, and opened it. The letter was 2 pages, written in Clem's careful cursive, dated September 1988. 1 year before he died. Dear stranger or family, or whoever you are, I am 71 years old and I have lived my whole life in a place most people pass through without stopping. I am going to die in a year or 2. The doctors have told me so in the careful language they used to tell you something you already knew, and I am trying to put my affairs in order without making a fuss about it. I want to tell you about the silo. I built it in 1947 with my own hands and the help of 3 neighbors who I have thanked in the only way I knew how. It has stored a great deal of grain over the years. It has also stored something else. In the worst years of this county's life, in the 1950s when the drought came back and the farms were failing, and the banks were calling loans and families were loading up and leaving for Wichita and Topeka, and never coming back, in those years I decided I was not going to watch my neighbors disappear. I had some money saved. Not much. But I had more than some people had, and I had a set of wrenches and 2 working hands, and the knowledge that a running engine and a dry grain bin can be the difference between staying and going. So I helped. I did not tell anyone because I was afraid they would feel they owed me something, and feeling that you owe someone is a kind of shame, and I did not want to shame my neighbors. I just helped as quietly as I could and kept a record so that I would know whether it had mattered. It mattered. I watched families stay who would have gone. I watched children grow up here who would have grown up somewhere else, farther from the sky and this light and this particular smell of the plains in September when the wheat is in and the air turns. I watched the town hold together in years when it should have come apart. That is what the silo was for. Not the grain. The grain was just how I paid for the rest. Now I want to tell you something about yourself. You found this because you needed to. I believe that. The property has been sitting here, held by the county, priced at what I priced it at, waiting for the right person to reach the bottom of what they had and discover there was still something under it. I know what that feels like. I lost everything once, too. I was 29 and I had nothing, and my family had turned away from me over something that was partly my fault and partly not. I sat in that folding chair in the middle of the floor for 3 nights before I decided to stay and build something. If you're sitting in that chair right now, hello, here is what I want to tell you. The thing that kept me going was not money, and it was not pride, and it was not the hope that someone would notice. It was usefulness. Doing something with my hands every day that made someone else's day possible. Not heroic, not noticed, just possible. You can do that too. However much or little you have, you can find someone who needs the slightly more that you have, and you can make their day possible. That is all I ever did. 40 years of it. The trust is yours, the property is yours, the ledger is yours to do what you see fit with. But the thing I want to leave you, the thing that matters more than the dollars, is the knowledge that a useful life looks ordinary from the outside. It looks like an old man in a grain silo. It looks like exactly what people would pass without stopping. But people who stop find something worth stopping for. I hope you stop. Clement Voss. Nora sat in the folding chair with the letter on her lap. She was 19 years old, holding a letter from a man born in 1917, written to someone he'd never met, describing the way he'd lived his life and why. He had been 29 when he lost everything and sat in this chair. She was 19. She looked at the curved walls of the silo, the light dropping from the hatch overhead. She thought about the 40 families in the ledger. She thought about Delia reading her father's name. About Eugene Henderson with his father's 1952 letter folded in his shirt pocket. She thought about Boyd Voss in Denver, who had taken Clem's $2,000 and built a business and never looked back. And she thought about the hearing, 6 weeks away. She stood up from the chair and went outside to find the windmill. It was still at an angle. The tail fin still pointed at the ground. But when Nora looked at the mechanism, she could see that it wasn't broken, just unfastened. The pin that locked the tail in operating position had corroded free, and the tail had drifted. She found a replacement pin in the same bin in the silo where Clem had kept his hardware, organized by type and size, in the small labeled containers of a man who didn't believe in losing track of things. She climbed the windmill platform and reattached the tail. When she climbed back down, the wind was already moving the blades. The pump handle moved. Water came up, brown at first, then clear. She stood at the pump with water running over her hands, cold and real, in the middle of 40 acres under a Kansas sky. She was 19 years old. She was just starting. The county courthouse in Ellis was larger than Harlan's, a 2-story limestone building with a flagpole in the center of the front lawn and a parking lot that was half full by 8:30 on the morning of the hearing. Nora arrived with Bev Acaffer, who had a briefcase, and the demeanor of someone who had won harder cases with less. They went through the front entrance and took the stairs to the second floor where the civil hearing rooms were. Boyd Voss was already there. She recognized him from the family gathering years ago. He was heavier now, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Nora earned in a month, with silver at his temples and the settled look of a man who expected to get what he paid for. His attorney sat beside him, a compact woman in her 40s who kept a yellow legal pad filled with notes. Boyd looked at Nora when she sat down. He didn't say anything. But she saw what was in his face, the same calculation she'd seen in Dwight's face when he was trying to understand how much she knew. Boyd was reading her the way he read properties. Assessing condition, estimating value, deciding whether the acquisition was worth the cost. She looked back at him steadily. He looked away first. The hearing room had a dozen seats in the gallery. By the time the judge entered, all of them were full. Eugene Henderson was there, in his western shirt, sitting straight. Sandra Colby. Dale Sutter, Delia, who had closed the post office for the morning for the first time in 11 years. Dwight from the elevator. A man named Everett who had driven from 60 miles away because his grandfather was in the ledger. A woman who had introduced herself in the hallway to Nora as the granddaughter of Darlene Colby. A retired schoolteacher who said she thought she knew something useful. 4 other people Nora didn't recognize who had come because Harlan news traveled fast, and Clem Voss's name still meant something in Ellis County. The judge called the hearing to order. Boyd's attorney opened with the case for equal consideration of Voss male line descendants. She was crisp and professional, citing case law on intestate succession and trust ambiguity, arguing that the restriction to the Carlin Voss female line was imprecise and potentially contrary to the testator's actual intent. Bev let her finish. Then she presented the trust instrument, the statement of intent, and the ledger. She went through the statement of intent slowly. She read the section where Clem had written, "I intend to leave the land to someone who will not waste it." She read the explicit reference to the Carlin family line. She presented the affidavits from Eugene Henderson, Sandra Colby, and Dale Sutter corroborating specific ledger entries. Then she found the Boyd entry. She read it aloud, all of it including the final note. A man can receive a kindness and choose to bury it, and that the burying is a kind of theft, not of dollars but of the record of what goodness was attempted. The gallery was very quiet. Bev looked at the judge. The testator was aware of the Voss male line. He was aware of Harold Voss and his son Boyd. He made a $2,000 loan to Harold Voss for Boyd's first property venture in 1974. That loan was never repaid. Clem recorded it. He did not record it out of anger. He recorded it because he wanted someone to know what had been attempted and what had been rejected. She paused. The trust was not written to exclude the Voss male line by oversight. It was written to exclude them by intention. Clement Voss understood the difference between people who received generosity and honored it and people who received it and buried it. She sat down. Boyd's attorney rose for rebuttal. She was good. She argued that the ledger was a private document without legal standing, that the loan entry was ambiguous, that Clem's personal feelings about repayment could not be inferred to constitute legal intent. The judge listened. He made notes. Then he asked if anyone in the gallery wished to speak. Eugene Henderson stood. He spoke for 3 minutes. He described his father, Ray Henderson, the seed money in 1952, the 4 children fed on that planting's produce. He read 2 sentences from his father's letter. He said that Clem Voss had made it possible for his family to stay in Harlan, and that he was still there, and that he understood what the ledger was and what it meant, and what Clem had intended. Sandra Colby spoke next. Then the retired schoolteacher, who it turned out had grown up on a farm 3 miles from the silo, and had watched Clem repair her father's tractor at no charge in 1963. Then Delia, briefly, precisely. Clement Voss spent 40 years building something for this county that most of us didn't know we were receiving until today. The trust is the last part of it. The judge looked at Boyd Voss. Boyd's attorney put a hand on his arm. Boyd sat back. The judge reviewed the documents for several minutes. Then he said, "The trust instrument is unambiguous. The statement of intent is explicit. The ledger is corroborated by multiple independent witnesses and documentary evidence. The restricted designation to lineal descendants of Margaret Voss Carlin is a clear and deliberate testamentary choice, not an oversight." He closed the folder. The motion to reopen the trust designation is denied. The petition for trust distribution to Nora Voss, as lineal descendant of Margaret Voss Carlin, is granted. This matter is closed. Nora exhaled. Bev gathered the papers without hurry. In the gallery, nobody made noise. People simply looked at each other with the expression of people who had carried something a long time and had just been told they could set it down. Boyd Voss sat very still for a moment. Then he stood and buttoned his jacket. He looked at Nora once more, and she saw what was in his face now, not calculation, not assessment, something older and less comfortable. A man who had spent 35 years not thinking about a name in a ledger, and who had just spent 3 months watching that name matter very much indeed. He walked out without speaking. His attorney gathered her notes and followed him. Outside the courthouse, the morning sun was on the limestone steps. Bev shook Nora's hand and went to her car. The gallery people came out one at a time and shook Nora's hand, too, or hugged her, or just stood nearby in the November wind. Dwight said, "Good." That was it, just good. Delia stood beside her on the steps for a while. "What are you going to do?" Delia asked. Nora looked at the parking lot, at the plain beyond it, at the flat horizon with the sky laid over it like a sheet of pale gray blue. "The silo needs a purpose," she said. Clem used it for grain storage when grain storage was useful. Then he found something else it was useful for. She thought about the 40 families in the ledger. About Dwight's disc harrow, about Dale Sutter and the sealed seam. "I think I know what it should be for now." Delia looked at her. "Tell me." "When it's ready," Nora said. "Come out Thursday, bring coffee." She drove back to Harlan alone, down the 2-lane road through the open country, watching the horizon rise and fall with the slow topography of the high plains. The windmill was turning when she pulled up to the property. She could see the blades from the road. She parked and stood for a moment looking at the silo. Then she went inside and sat in the folding chair in the center of the floor. Clem had sat here. She was sitting here now. The light came down through the hatch overhead the same as it always had. She picked up his letter from where she'd set it on the shelf. She read the last paragraph again. "The thing I want to leave you is the knowledge that a useful life looks ordinary from the outside." She folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. Then she went to find Dwight. There was work to do. 5 months later, the silo was not what it had been. The corrugated steel walls were the same, rust-patched and solid. The floor was the same poured concrete, cracked in one corner, a crack Nora had left because it was the one through which the weed had pushed in winter. The hatch was the same. The ladder was the same. But the interior had been converted. Not renovated, converted, a different thing. 1/4 of the circular space held a workbench and a set of basic tools organized on a pegboard in the same outlined fashion as Clem's own repair bay. One quarter held shelving, restocked from the grain elevator's surplus, and from donations from people in Harlan, whose names appeared in the ledger. One quarter held a table with 4 chairs, a coffee maker, and a wall where Nora had hung 3 things: the photograph of Clem standing by the silo in 1949, the original pages of his statement of intent framed under glass, and a printed copy of the first page of the ledger, not because the families needed to see their names, but because she needed to remember that the record was the point. The fourth quarter was open. Nora had begun what she called the open quarter in March, when a 17-year-old named Eli came to the elevator looking for work, and Dwight told him there wasn't any, and Nora heard it from the back office and came out front. Eli was the kind of 17 that 19 had felt like. He had a threadbare jacket, and a phone with a cracked screen, and the careful stillness of someone who had learned not to ask for too much. She gave him a cup of coffee, and asked what he knew how to do. He knew how to drive a tractor, he knew how to fix a fence post. He didn't know how to do much else, but he knew those things well, which meant his hands were already trained to be useful. She hired him for the week. By the end of the week, she'd offered him the open quarter. He'd been sleeping in his car, which he hadn't said but she'd worked out from the small signs. The open quarter had a cot and a lamp and nothing else, which was more than a car. He took it without making it a conversation, which was the right way to take such things. By the time April came, he was fixing fence lines for 3 different landowners in the county, work Nora had found him through Delia's network of people who knew what needed doing. He split the money with Nora for the silo space, a dollar figure that was nominal and both of them knew it, but he insisted on paying something, and she didn't argue because she understood why. She'd done the same thing herself once. The trust funds had resolved by February. The county court had processed the distribution, and the CD and insurance proceeds had transferred to a new account in Nora's name. The Mineral Rights Survey had found no commercially exploitable deposits, which the county land assessor had told her was likely from the beginning. But the rights held value as a hedge against future development, and Bev had recommended she maintain them in trust. The money was substantial. Not life-changing in the way it would have been for someone with less experience of what nothing felt like, but substantial. Enough to repair the property properly. Enough to invest in what the silo was becoming. She hadn't spent most of it. She had repaired the silo roof, properly this time, with an actual roofing contractor who did the whole structure, not just the seam. She had paid Eli's wages, and the coffee, and the utilities on a small power connection she'd run from the road. She had bought the tools and the shelving and the coffee maker. The rest she had put in a new account. She'd asked Bev to help her structure it. She called it the Voss account. It was not legally a trust. It was a private fund, managed simply, with one rule she'd written on an index card and taped to the inside of the account register. Help as quietly as you can. Keep a record so you know whether it mattered. She kept the ledger. On the shelf below the framed statement of intent, she kept a new composition book. She'd started her own entries in January. They were shorter than Clem's. She didn't have 40 years of context, but they were in the same format, and she used the same careful column headings, and in the forgiven column she put the same checkmarks for the ones she knew would never come back as money, and left the column blank for the ones still waiting. The record was the point. Delia came out on Thursdays, the way she'd started doing in November. She brought coffee and gossip, and occasionally a name. Someone in the county she'd heard was struggling in a way that wasn't being said out loud. Nora listened and wrote it down and figured out what was needed and found a quiet way to make it available. Sometimes it was money. More often it was something else. A connection, a recommendation, a day of Eli's work, a bag of seed from the elevator's surplus that Dwight set aside without asking why. Dwight had started coming on Fridays, ostensibly to check on the equipment, actually to drink coffee and talk about what Clem had been doing in the years when Dwight had known him as just an old man who kept to himself. They were building a picture of Clem together, Nora and Delia and Dwight and Eugene Henderson and the others, the way you build a picture of someone you didn't know well enough when you had the chance. Boyd Voss had not returned to Kansas. Nora had thought about him, occasionally, not with anger, more with the flat curiosity she'd felt reading his entry in the ledger. A man can receive a kindness and choose to bury it. She understood the burying better than she had before. There was a cost to letting a gift land. You had to acknowledge it, carry it, feel its weight. Some people couldn't do that. Some people needed the kindness to disappear into the infrastructure of their life and become invisible, and the only way to make it invisible was to never speak of it. She thought she might write him a letter someday, not about the trust, Just a note that said, "He kept a record and the record shows you were helped, and I thought you should know someone knew it and it wasn't nothing." She hadn't written it yet. There was time. Spring came to the high plains the way it always did, slowly and then all at once. The dormant grass going green in a single warm week. The sky lifting from its winter gray to a blue so clear it looked painted. The windmill turned steadily in the April wind, pumping water into the tank that now served both the hand pump and a garden bed Nora had put in along the east wall of the silo's foundation. In soil she'd amended through the winter with compost from the elevator's grain husks. She was growing tomatoes. They were not doing particularly well yet, but it was early, and she had time. On the first Saturday in May, she drove to Wichita and brought her grandmother back to Harlan for the day. Her grandmother had not been to Harlan in decades. She sat in the passenger seat of the used truck Nora had bought in March and watched the flat country pass outside the window with the expression of someone recognizing something they had thought was gone. At the property line, she asked Nora to stop the truck. She looked at the silo. "That's Clem's," she said. "It's mine now," Nora said. "He left it for someone in the family. I found it first." Her grandmother looked at her. She was 81, her left eye worse than last winter but her right eye still sharp. She looked at Nora for a long time. "He would have liked you," she said. Nora drove the rest of the way to the silo and parked. She helped her grandmother out of the truck and walked beside her slowly toward the door. Inside, her grandmother stood at the center of the floor, in the open quarter where the folding chair still sat. She looked at the framed statement of intent on the wall. At the photograph of Clem, 1949, hand on the silent wall, squinting into the sun. "He had a falling out with the family when I was in my 20s, she said. "Something to do with the family property, decisions about what to sell." Clem didn't agree and said so, and everyone got angry and then nobody spoke. She shook her head. 40 years of not speaking because of a piece of land nobody ended up keeping anyway. She walked slowly to the workbench and touched the edge of it. "He was always doing things," she said. "When we were children, he was always fixing something for someone. Mother used to say he couldn't walk past a broken thing without stopping." She stopped at the shelf with the composition book. Nora watched her open it. Her grandmother read the first few pages in silence. Her expression didn't change. When she closed it, she pressed it against the shelf with one hand and stood like that for a moment. "You're doing it too," she said. "Trying to," Nora said. Her grandmother turned and looked at her. She didn't say anything else about it. She sat down in the folding chair, and Nora brought her coffee, and they sat together in the silo while the May wind moved the windmill outside and the light came down through the hatch overhead and turned gold on the concrete floor. The same light it had always been, falling in the same circle, in the center of a 40-acre property on the edge of a small Kansas town that a man had chosen not to leave. Late in the afternoon, before Nora drove her home, her grandmother held her hand on the step of the silo. "He would have liked you very much," she said again. Nora squeezed her hand and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would add to it. She helped her grandmother into the truck and drove her home through the long Kansas evening. She came back to the silo alone at dusk. Eli was at the workbench reading from a manual, the desk lamp casting a circle of yellow light. He'd started studying for a CDL in the evenings, a plan he hadn't mentioned until it was already mostly arranged, which was the right way to make plans when you'd learned not to count on them until they were done. "Dinner's on the shelf," he said without looking up. She hadn't asked him to cook. He'd done it anyway, the way people do things in a place that has become, quietly and without announcement, a home. She looked at the shelf. A covered pot. She lifted the lid. Soup from things she had in the cabinet. She sat at the table and ate. Outside, the windmill turned. The tomato plants were visible through the small window she'd put into the south wall, pale green rose in the dark. She thought about the folding chair the first night. She thought about the $8 and the empty duffel bag and the world informing her, clearly and without apology, that she didn't fit anywhere inside it. She thought about Clem sitting in this chair at 29 with nothing, deciding to stay and build something. She closed her eyes. The soup was warm, the lamp was on, the record was kept. Some people build walls to hold what they have. Some people build doors so what they have keeps moving. Clem built a door and called it a grain silo and left it at $8 and waited. That is the kind of building that lasts.